Hello and good day to everyone. My name is Kyle Garland, and I'm with the Joint Special Operations University located in Tampa, Florida. I want to welcome everyone to another episode of Think JSOW. Think JSOW is an ongoing series that explores research and publications from JSOW faculty, resident senior fellows, leading academics, and the wider SOF international security community. Today, as part of our SOF Heritage and History collection, we are exploring the topic of unconventional warfare as conducted by Virginia Hall during World War II. And we are honored today to be able to interview Mr. Craig Gralley. Mr. Gralley is a former senior intelligence officer with the Central Intelligence Agency. He has broad experience across the agency's directorates, and among other assignments, Mr. Gralley was the chief speechwriter for CIA directors William Webster, Robert Gates, and James Woolsey. He also served as an analyst and manager within CIA's Analysis Directorate, the National Intelligence Council, and CIA's Office of the Inspector General. As a freelance writer, Mr. Gralley recently authored the book Hall of Mirrors, Virginia Hall, America's Greatest Spy, World War II. And here's a copy of what the book cover looks like. Hall of Mirrors is a historical fiction novel written about the personal and professional life of Virginia Hall. Many of us know that Virginia Hall was a highly decorated member of the British Special Operations Executive and the U.S. Office of Strategic Services during World War II. And then later, she was an agent with the Central Intelligence Agency after the war. Today, Mr. Gralley will discuss Virginia Hall's tremendous accomplishments in espionage and unconventional warfare while operating behind enemy lines in France during World War II. Mr. Gralley, thank you very much for joining us today. Can you please begin with an overview of Virginia Hall and her exploits during World War II?
Certainly, Kyle, and thanks so much for having me today, and special thanks to the Joint Special Operations University for allowing me to speak about my favorite topic, Virginia Hall. As Kyle mentioned, I was a CIA employee for 34 years. I wasn't a spy, I was a case officer and a senior manager and analyst, but mostly a writer. And as Kyle mentioned, I was the chief speechwriter for 3 directors, including Bob Gates. I'd worked in virtually all the major directorates. I have a good understanding of the world of espionage, and I've traveled extensively, primarily throughout Latin America and and South America, and also in war zones, including Iraq and Afghanistan. I retired in 2013 and became a part-time consultant for CIA. Working in the CIA history staff, as well as working document declassification. And it's there that I ran into Virginia Hall's file. It was a fascinating file, and at the same time, I'd gone back to school to work on a master's degree at Johns Hopkins in writing, and I needed a thesis topic. And seeing Virginia Hall's file and understanding the requirements for grad, I decided to do my thesis on Virginia Hall. And it turned out that my thesis advisors had taken a look at my thesis and were very enthusiastic. They had never seen anything about Virginia Hall in the public domain. And they recommended that not only do I complete my thesis on Virginia Hall, but also continue by writing a book. And so that was basically the origin of why I decided to write a book about Virginia Hall. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, this is of course Virginia Hall. It's a passport photo of Virginia Hall for those of you who have not seen her before. The next slide, Kyle. Recently, the public has discovered Virginia Hall. Virginia Hall's popularity is increasing tremendously. I started working on my book about 6 years ago, and I thought I had cornered the story. There were 2 books that had been written 2 decades earlier, one called Wolves at the Door by Judith Powers, and another one called L'Espagne de Virginia Hall by Vincent Nuzel. So I thought that 2 decades earlier, it was time for another book about Virginia Hall. But 2 years actually into my research, I found out that 2 other books were in the works. One, of course, was called A Woman of No Importance, that was subsequently published by Sonia Purnell, and another book, The Lady is a Spy, written by Don Mitchell. But what was good news is that they weren't necessarily competitive books. There was a synergy among the books, because A Woman of No Importance is a straight biography that's about Virginia Hall, and The Lady is a Spy is a young adult book that was written by Don Mitchell. My own book, Hall of Mirrors, was a historical fiction, even though it was written based on hundreds of documents that I had gleaned from the CIA and from British and American archives and elsewhere. I told the story as a first-person narrative, that is, as Virginia Hall would be telling her own story. So all three books are different. All three books are written for different audiences, so that there's a synergy among the books, and there really isn't a competition between them. Still, there's a bit of a media frenzy. CNN basically has called Virginia Hall the next America's next great hero. Sonia and I were interviewed on National Public Radio Morning Edition. The Washington Post has done articles on our books. There are two movies in production now about Virginia Hall. One is A Woman of No Importance, that's starring Daisy Ridley of Star Wars fame, that is currently in production. There's another one that is called Liberté, A Call to Spy, which is by Sarah Megan Thomas, who stars as Virginia Hall, which just went to the Santa Barbara Film Festival and will be out shortly. In the meantime, I've also basically reviewed two other books from other authors that are going to be coming out soon too. So it's not surprising that Virginia Hall has captured the public's imagination. And everybody's going to be seeing a lot more about Virginia Hall in the coming weeks and months. It's not surprising because it's a great story. Next slide. This is a yearbook picture of Virginia Hall. Let's talk a little bit about her life. Growing up, she led a charmed life. She lived on the family's 110-acre farm in Boxhorn, which was called Boxhorn Farm, right outside of Baltimore. She took her summers in Europe with her family. She attended the exclusive Roland Park School. She was a good, but not really a great student, but she had a passion to lead. She was class president, editor of the book club, editor of her yearbook, captain of the field hockey team. She had done all of the things that recognized her as a leader within the school. But what really kind of caught my attention about Virginia Hall was that she loved to act in school plays. Role-playing seemed to be kind of what she enjoyed doing most. She enjoyed kind of being, there was a freedom that she found in acting as someone else. And I thought that was kind of an interesting introduction to the world of espionage. In school, she always took the lead role. She played the pirate chief, according to her niece, Lorna Catling, who I interviewed. Her yearbook also called her one of the most original students. She had a streak of boldness and self-confidence. Once, in fact, she actually brought a snake to school wrapped around her wrist as a bracelet. So that gives you a little bit of an indication of the kind of person that Virginia Hall was. But she also was a rebellious student. She refused to take required classes at Barnard and Radcliffe, where she went. In fact, one of the classes that she refused to take was gym, which I found to be a rather interesting refusal on her part. So she dropped out of both Barnard and Radcliffe because, again, she refused to take these classes. After leaving Radford, she traveled to Europe, where she took classes in Grenoble, France, and Paris. And she eventually graduated at the Consular Academy in Vienna, Austria. So that tells you the kind of person that she was. She was very independent. She loved to travel. And while she was there, she began to learn languages and the culture that later would serve her very well. Virginia's ambition was never to be a spy. In fact, in 1930, after she graduated from the Consular Academy, she was a clerk for the State Department with the goal of becoming an ambassador. Now, all of us know that in the 1930s, it's a much different world, and in that goal was mostly we would think as being an impossible dream, because at the time there were only, of the 2,000 Foreign Service officers, about 6 were women. And at that time also, there were no women ambassadors. So again, this demonstrates the kind of personality that Virginia Hall had, and that she was always trying to be breaking barriers even as she was growing up. But she was undeterred, and she began studying for the Foreign Service examination. As you know, there's an oral and a written part of the Foreign Service examination in order to become, both of which you have to pass in order to become a member of the Foreign Service. The next slide. But in December 1933, disaster struck. Virginia was bird hunting on the Gediz Peninsula in Turkey when she was trying to climb over a barbed wire fence. She tripped, the gun discharged, and she shot herself in the ankle and foot. When gangrene set in, they cut off the leg. They amputated her leg just below the left knee, and they fit it with a wooden appendage very similar to something like this. Now, this is not her leg, but this is an example of the kind of appendage that they had back in the 1930s. You see that it's a carved wood. It doesn't have any articulated foot. It has a kind of a stocking on the bottom of the foot. It's strapped onto the thigh. So it's you could tell that it's very crude and not very well articulated. Virginia Hall's leg weighed exactly, or pretty close to 7 pounds. It took about a year for her to recuperate, but to add insult to injury, the State Department barred Virginia from taking her Foreign Service examination because the State Department had discriminatory rules against people with amputations serving in the Foreign Service. Virginia fought it really hard. I mean, she pulled out all the stops. She talked to her, she enlisted friends in high places. In fact, she had a contact that knew President Roosevelt, and he wrote Secretary of State Cordell Hull, but Hull was unrelenting. He said, no, we've got these rules, and we're not going to allow Virginia to take her Foreign Service examination. So Virginia was really disgusted by this whole thing. She quit and began to travel Europe, and that really started kind of like the beginning of her real education. She lived in France. She learned languages, eventually learning 5 languages, began to understand the culture and the history of France. And in fact, when Hitler came to power and started invading France in June of 1940, Virginia was an ambulance driver in the outskirts of Paris. And when the Germans invaded Paris, Virginia fled, and she went to, surprisingly, ground zero, which for the war, which was actually in London at the time, where the Battle of Britain was taking place. So instead of going home, she decided to check out London and see what she could do in order to help the cause. Okay, next slide. In London, she caught the attention of the British Special Operations Executive, who were looking for people who were willing to take dangerous assignments and live among the enemy and report back. Virginia was really a prime recruit for them. She spoke 5 languages, as I mentioned, the Allied as well as the enemy languages. She knew the knowledge, she had knowledge of customs, and she was independent and fearless. But what really made Virginia a very attractive candidate was the fact that she had a US passport. At the time, the US was neutral in the war, and having a US passport allowed Virginia to travel throughout France and ask allowed her to travel throughout France. And she had a cover assignment as a journalist for the New York Post. That allowed her to ask probing questions of French and German political and military leaders, and allowed her to report all of this information back to her spy masters back in London. Her first mission was codenamed Geologist 5, and she was just asked to be the eyes and ears for the SOE. She was at the time the first Allied sleeper agent. She's actually an agent to live behind the outlines in Vichy, France. There were no other agents that were living behind the lines that were SOE officers. Her first mission to be eyes and ears, and she was requested to stay for 3 months, but she actually stayed for 15. And she did a lot more than what they had planned. She was a lot more than eyes and ears because she helped organize resistance groups, coordinated jailbreaks, planned sabotage operations, and reported back to the Brits. Now, those in espionage know that the longer that you stay in the foreign or a denied enemy territory, the more likely it is that you're going to be discovered. And Virginia, in fact, was betrayed, and her name was given to the Gestapo, who was the Klaus Barbie, the butcher of Lyon, who was responsible for the deaths of over 25,000 French men, women, and children. He's reported to have said, I would give anything to get my hands on that limping bitch. So he was after Virginia in a bad way. Next slide. But as Klaus Barbie closed in, Virginia's only avenue of escape was over the snow-capped Pyrenees, and this was in November of 1942. You'll recall during that period of time, the Allies had invaded North Africa, and they were pushing the Germans out of North Africa, and the Germans were retreating into France. Virginia knew that with more Germans, the Gestapo would be looking to root out all of the spies that were in what was known then as the unoccupied area of France. Virginia was tipped off that she was not only under suspicion, but that they were coming to get her, and she had to leave late at night. She was given like 2 hours notice, and she took the train to the Pyrenees Mountains. Now, she originally wanted to go via Marseille, but of course, at that time, the Germans were flooding France, and the whole coast of the Mediterranean along the French border was swarming with Germans. So her only really avenue of escape was over the French Pyrenees. She took the trip late at night. She arrived at the Pyrenees and she found a passeur who was a French guide, or actually a Spanish guide, who took her over the mountains. It was quite an ordeal. This was in November of 1942. The winter had set in the mountains. There was snow throughout the Pyrenees. This was a 50-mile, 3-day trip over the mountains. And Virginia had said that this was the most difficult thing that she ever had to do in her life. And I can only imagine trying to climb over the Pyrenees with a prosthetic leg that weighed 7 pounds and dragging it behind me. So it took an amazing amount of courage and determination in order to climb over the Pyrenees. And I discovered the trail, and I'll talk a little bit about it a little bit later, and have a few more pictures about the trek that Virginia Hall actually did take. Now, most of us, after climbing over the Pyrenees, would say, geez, I've had enough. It's time to go home. But Virginia said no. She said, I'm going to go back to France. The Brits said, no, you're not, because traditionally, any agent who had been burned overseas couldn't go back to the same location where they had been burned. At the time, Klaus Barbie was still hunting for her. There were posters up. There was a bounty on her head. And still, she was very determined to go back to France. But that was not to be, at least with the Special Operations Executive. So what Virginia did was kind of clever. She went to the Americans, who had just established the Office of Strategic Services, and the OSS was in a bind. They had, D-Day was rapidly approaching, and they only had 3 agents on the ground in France at the time. And Virginia had a tremendous amount of knowledge. She knew all of the SOE agents. She knew where they were located. She had knowledge of the languages and the culture. They needed her so desperately that they violated the usual prescriptions about going back after being burned, and they in fact took on Virginia Hall as one of their agents. So she did return just on the eve of the D-Day invasion and led over 1,000 resistance fighters, where she blew up bridges. She destroyed communications networks and fuel depots, and ultimately helped secure the success of the D-Day invasion. So that concludes kind of like my initial comments.
Okay, well, great. Thanks very much, Mr. Gralley. I mean, obviously what the story of Virginia Hall is fascinating, and what she was able to accomplish, you know, back in that time was truly remarkable. But so now on behalf of our listeners, if you wouldn't mind, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions. And some of these you've touched on a little bit during your presentation, but when I first picked up your book and read it, I was expecting an autobiography, or I'm sorry, a biography. And you mentioned that you wrote it as a historical fiction. Now, may I ask you, why did you decide to write it in that format?
That's a good question, Kyle. I had done all of the research that all of the other authors had done on the books. I'd gone to the US and British archives, I'd taken a look at CIA's documents and their holdings, and conducted interviews with the last remaining relative. So I could have written a very good biography. But because of my background and experience with the CIA, I thought I could go deeper. Since I have an understanding of intelligence operations, CIA tradecraft, I'd been to war zones, I'd seen women in action in war zones, and I had access to a CIA psychiatrist who specialized in trauma and was a member of Operation Iraqi Freedom. I thought I could relate to the reader what it's like to operate in a hostile environment and how agents would act under pressure, and offer some insights into the mind of the covert operative. To explain to the reader a little bit about why Virginia acted as she did, and add some emotional impact to the story. So I tried to tell the story as Virginia Hall would have told it herself. And that's what I thought I could add to the story to make it a lot more personal and memorable for the reader. That's why I chose to write in what they call first person, which means writing it as Virginia Hall would be telling her own story. So since it's written as Virginia would tell it, it's considered historical fiction. But mostly I felt as if I could tell the story in a deeper way, in a way that would provide more emotional impact and actually describe the feelings of what a covert operator would be going through during a harrowing time of our country's history.
Oh, great. Well, thank you. Like I mentioned, what she was able to accomplish was truly remarkable. Sir, in your opinion, what 2 or 3, you know, of professional characteristics made Virginia Hall so successful conducting unconventional warfare? Obviously, she went back to France twice. Once, as you mentioned, after she had already been burned, but she was very successful. So, could you tell me what you think her characteristics that made her so successful, which would be relevant to special operations forces of today?
Certainly. Virginia operated obviously in a very stress-filled and lethal environment. She was operating solo with no backup, no cavalry to come to the rescue if she ran into trouble. There's no record that Virginia had received any operational training in the UK. Now remember, Virginia went into France during a time when there really weren't too many special operations executives, officers in the field, or had gone through the pipeline yet. So they hadn't really developed any kind of a training program prior to Virginia going in. And she received very infrequent airdrops, which means that she had little or no equipment. So let's recap this. She says she's behind enemy lines, she's all alone, she has no operational training, and very little equipment. So how did she survive in this kind of lethal environment? Okay, some of her personal characteristics. She was extremely self-disciplined. She had street smarts. she was told to keep her eyes and ears open and her mouth shut. And that's exactly what she did. She had told, in retrospect, she had told some friends that too many of my friends had been killed because they talked too much. That is not a criticism that could be leveled at Virginia at all. She didn't see her trip as some other SOE agents had seen it in France as a cat and mouse game. She knew it was deadly serious, and she kept to her tradecraft, and she kept her mouth shut. Even after she retired, basically, she gave no interviews, wrote no memoir, said very little about her life overseas, even with her closest friends and relatives. So she obviously believed that keeping her mouth shut was an important part of her survival tradecraft. Besides being self-disciplined, I think one of the great personal characteristics that Virginia had was resilience. She had persevered through a variety of difficult life experiences. The pain of losing her leg, gender and disability discrimination. And one of the psychiatrists at the agency that I talked to said that her life experiences helped her to develop really a stoic self-confidence that she needed in order to thrive in an extremely lethal environment. He also said something that really kind of changed my attitudes towards people with disabilities. He said that that it might not have been it might not have been because of Virginia's disability, but in spite of it, that she was able to do great things. In other words, she had been given a second chance at life, and she wasn't going to waste it. Now, certainly Virginia had a lot of these kind of characteristics early on that I described when taking a look at her yearbook. I mean, she had a passion to lead, she was fearless, and so forth. But all of these things, as well as her understanding of culture, allowed her to bring them together in a complete package that allowed the SOE to take advantage, and certainly the OSS later on. So she'd been given this second chance at life, and she wasn't going to waste it. So I would consider those things like perseverance, resilience, and one other thing I might mention is that Virginia had a tremendous understanding of the operational environment too. She knew the culture and the politics and the religion of the area, and that allowed her room to maneuver and act like a local when she had to blend into the environment. Most importantly, perhaps when it comes to these cultural issues, she understood the language of the allies, the French and Russian, and she also understood the language of the enemies, German and Italian, so that she was the kind of like the complete package when it came to not only evading the enemy, but also understanding the important intelligence that was needed that she was able to report back to her spy masters, first in the UK and then later on the American OSS. So those are some of the characteristics that I think that were important for her: self-discipline, resilience, and knowledge of the operational environment.
Yeah, absolutely, extremely important, and thank you. Next question, sir. During your presentation, you mentioned she made an escape after her 15 months over the Pyrenees mountains. You mentioned it was 50 miles over the course of 3 days. In fact, your last photo looked like it was pretty rugged terrain there, and she has a prosthetic leg, one that weighs 7 pounds. If you wouldn't mind, could you elaborate a little bit on her escape and maybe demonstrate or explain some of the hardships other than the 7-pound prosthetic leg that she had to go through in order to make her escape?
Sure, absolutely. I'd be glad to. No one knew exactly where the trail was, where it was located, and it was virtually undiscovered. When I arrived in France, basically all I had was a paragraph from a book that was written in French, and French was not a language that I spoke, so I had to use my wife, who was fluent in French, in order to kind of help guide me through but it was just a single paragraph, and it offered very few clues as to what exactly the trail that Virginia took. I knew that if I wrote the book, I'd have to understand some of the challenges that she faced in order to get some of the emotional impact from the story and to translate that into the book. So my first step, after having only one paragraph, was to go to the museum in Saint-Giron, which was dedicated to freedom trails. The French have museums for virtually everything. But this Freedom Trail Museum was really just kind of a one-room museum that was manned for 2 hours every other Thursday. So I was fortunate to be able to at least get in. But once we got in, we talked to the proprietor, who only spoke French, but she had never heard of Virginia Hall, or she didn't know of Vincent Neuzel's book or anything. So we were really kind of out of luck when it came to the museum, the Freedom Trail Museum in Saint-Géron. So we figured that our only option was really to go to Villefranche-de-Conflent, which was identified in Neuzel's book as being the location for the start of the trail. So we went to the town's information center, and there we were met with a whole bunch of blank stares and shoulder shrugs. But I managed to talk to a woman who, in broken English, knew at least some people who might know. So she made some telephone calls, spoke with some people, and then she came back and she reported, yeah, there's one trail that's at the edge of town that follows the river, but you got to be really careful because that trail is really steep. So that began our trek to the trail. We followed the unmarked trail by the river, really just a path. And we went through a variety of towns and grew more excited when in the center of town, in the small village called PY, we saw a map. And you might want to put this one up now, Kyle, the picture of the map. Oh, okay, it's the next one. There we go. We found this map under glass in the middle of town that seemed to hit all of the markers that Neuzel had in his book, and that I had read in some of the documentation from Virginia Hall's file. So at this point, we knew that we had found the trail, and we discovered the trail, and we're very excited about it. I do have some additional slides here that demonstrate the kinds of terrain that Virginia Hall had to traverse in order to escape the Gestapo in November of 1942. So Kyle, if you want to hit the next one, that'll give us a little bit more understanding. This is in France. It's a varied terrain. There was mountains as well as bold streams that she had to cross. And again, you think of a woman with a prosthetic leg and how she would get through some of these obstacles. It was an obstacle course, basically, that littered both France and Spain for 50 miles, over mountains, through bold streams, and again, she was doing it in wintertime when there's snow on the ground. So I can only imagine that she was slipping and sliding the whole way through, falling down, picking herself up, and continuing on the trek. And again, she mentioned that crossing the Pyrenees was the hardest thing that she had ever done. Take a look at the next slide. This is a trail going down to Spain from it's Virginia Hall's trail. It gives you another idea of some of the terrain that she had to traverse. When we take a look at the next slide. This is part of the trail along a mountain slope. Again, I was there. This was in August of just this past year, and you can tell that there's still snow on the slopes. Notice how steep it is, and the kind of and still snow on the ground. So obviously, in the November timeframe, she would have to traverse something that was much more treacherous than this. Go ahead, next slide.
Okay, that was the last slide.
Okay, we have the movie.
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, I took this movie from the top of the mountain, actually the border from France and Spain. We're looking down. This is from Pic de la Donna. We're looking down at the valley towards France that Virginia had to climb over. Now, again, this is at the Spanish border leading into Spain. She had to climb over this ridge and down into the valley below. You can see where that valley is. She had another 20 miles to go after she had gone over this ridge. So it was quite a feat on her part in order to make it through this harrowing event.
Wow, that's quite a bit. Okay, so well, thank you very much. Next question. After World War II, we all know that Virginia Hall entered into the CIA. Do you have any insights on what her life was like in the agency after World War II?
Sure. Virginia, of course, when she joined the agency in 1951, was one of the first female clandestine officers in the Operations Directorate. And her job at that time was to work against newly installed communist government operations in Europe and Latin America. She was a trailblazer, but it wasn't really a happy time for her. She was mostly behind a desk. The world was changing. The hot war from World War II had turned cold. It required a different kind of a skill set. The way that ops officers at the agency are promoted, it's by being overseas. And she did a few extended TDYs, but largely stayed back at Langley. But it's also the fact that she suffered a lot of discrimination back at the agency as well. It's kind of odd that some of the characteristics that made her invisible and so successful in wartime, basically her gender and her disability, also worked against her in peacetime. In the early 1950s, there was institutionalized discrimination actually at the CIA. And to give you an example, women ops officers were only allowed to rise to the level of GS-14, while men could rise to GS-17. So the way I take a look at it, Virginia's talents were squandered. The agency personnel and officers really didn't know what to do with Virginia. She was a woman who had a lot of operational experience, but they really didn't take advantage of it. And what I think that should have done was to put her or allow her to rise to a level in the training directorate where she could have taught ops officers training for overseas clandestine operations. But it didn't come to pass. She retired on a medical disability when she was 60 years old, and then went into living on a farm in Barnesville, Maryland, for the rest of her life. And she died in 1982 at the age of 76. But it wasn't a happy time for her. She suffered discrimination, and agency folks didn't really know what to do with her, and there really could have been more opportunities to take advantage of her tremendous skill and ability.
Yeah. Like you mentioned, definitely seems like a waste of a great resource.
Absolutely.
Okay, sir. Well, one final question, if you don't mind, and this question I think you've touched on a little bit throughout your presentation and your comments, but our audience are primarily going to be special operations forces and those who support special operations forces. So what lessons can our modern day members of the United States Special Operations Command, what lessons can they glean from Virginia Hall's groundbreaking work during World War II?
That's a good question. So I think that regardless of the era or the level of technology, unconventional warfare is really about being on the ground. It's about being up close to the enemy. It's person to person in threatening environments. And Virginia Hall's career in espionage kind of epitomizes living with that threat. Behind enemy lines, operating alone, no training, little equipment. So rather than thinking in terms of new or novel operational techniques or tradecraft, I think the lessons of Virginia Hall come down to this. I think it comes down to mastering yourself. Everyone gets bumps and bruises. Use the hard knocks and unfairness of life to develop a resilience. And that's what Virginia did. Use that resilience to your advantage. Know that you've overcome a lot and that you can use it to control your stress and fear and become really self-reliant. And that's basically also what the the psychiatrist at the agency told me about Virginia Hall, and was a key to her success. And they also, another takeaway is from Virginia Hall's life is to master the target, understand the languages, cultures, and politics, so that when the time comes, you can act with full confidence that you're the best that you can be. So I think it boils down to those two things: mastering yourself and mastering the target, so that you can survive in those kinds of difficult situations.
Yes, sir. Great advice. And finally, we're gonna go ahead and sign off here, sir. But do you have any closing comments that you'd like to add before we do?
First of all, let me say it was a delight talking to you today. I really enjoy talking about Virginia Hall and the kinds of skills and abilities and her capabilities, her life, and what they mean for us today. If your audience is interested, I do have a website and a blog. It's www.craiggralley.com, CraigGralley.com. And in it, it has a variety of stories and pictures about Virginia Hall and her life in espionage. And there's much more to Virginia Hall's story about and her life that is very interesting for a variety of people. So more pictures, more stories on CraigGralley.com.
Well, great, Craig. Thank you very much for sharing your time and your expertise with us today. Really, I think your discussion is fascinating, and I believe very interesting to our wider audience in the United States Special Operations Command. For those of you who are listening, upcoming topics on Think JSOW will include authors from our U.S. SOCOM Commanders reading list, as well as some current research that's being conducted by our JSOW faculty and senior fellows. But in the meantime, as I think hopefully all of you know, you can follow JSOW on LinkedIn and Facebook, or you can check out our upcoming courses and events on our website, which is www.socom.mil/JSOU. Again, Mr. Gralley, thanks very much for participating on our Think JSOW edition today. Again, I've said it many times, but it's a very interesting story that I think we need to share with U.S. SOCOM, because this is part of our heritage. This is part of our history. So again, thank you. And this concludes this edition of Think JSOW.